"Where are you from, again?" Marissa's smirk wasn't curiosity, it was mockery. Laughter echoed as Ivy quietly sipped her tea, pretending not to hear. "Maybe she needs subtitles," someone whispered, louder this time. But Ivy didn't flinch. She just smiled, because what they didn't know, the woman they mocked, had already translated for presidents and the United Nations. And when the biggest client arrived, speaking 3 languages, she stood up, switched tongues effortlessly, and left them all speechless. Welcome to Dignity Tales. Let's uncover what really happened. The air in the office was thick with anticipation, the kind that preceded the arrival of any new hire. It was Monday morning, and the usual hum of activity seemed heightened today, as whispers flitted through the air like ghosts. Today, a new employee would join the team, a woman from somewhere that no one could quite place. Her accent, they said, was strange, hard to decipher. She had grown up in a small village far from the polished streets of the city, and somehow, the idea of her seemed like a curious interruption to the predictable rhythm they all lived by. The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open with a soft swish. The woman stepped out, her eyes scanning the room, taking in the hum of the office. She wore a simple black dress, nothing flashy, with her dark hair neatly pulled into a bun at the nape of her neck. The simplicity of her appearance was striking, as though she had no interest in drawing attention to herself. Her shoes clicked against the marble floor, the sound sharp in contrast to the soft murmurs that followed her entrance. She smiled politely at the receptionist, offering a soft "good morning" in her thick accent, and the receptionist's face froze, her lips twitching before she quickly masked it with a professional smile. People glanced at one another, noting the unfamiliar lilt in her voice. The sound was almost melodic, but in a way they weren't used to. She made her way through the corridors, carrying a folder, her hands poised in a calm grace that belied the stares that followed her. The whispers began immediately, the laughter stifled just enough to be out of earshot, but not enough to avoid being heard by those who mattered. She was the outsider, the odd one who didn't belong in this polished, fast-paced world. Unaware of the quiet judgment she was receiving, she entered the meeting room, set her folder down on the table, and straightened her back. The quiet arrival, marked by the faint scent of lavender from her perfume, was all she needed to make her presence felt. It was a quiet strength, unspoken yet undeniable, and it would change everything. As she walked through the long, sleek hallway, the buzz of conversation picked up. Her footsteps, once the only sound in the corridor, seemed now to echo, though she walked with a careful, steady pace, head held high. The open spaces, with their polished floors and towering glass windows, felt cold to her, yet she was determined to blend into this unfamiliar world, even as the whispers began to rise around her. At first, it was just the faint hum of voices, soft enough that she could pretend not to notice. But it didn't take long for the rumors to travel. Her accent, so pronounced, was like an odd instrument in an orchestra of well-practiced, smooth sounds. She caught fragments of their words. "Where's she from? Did you hear her accent? It's so different. Is she even qualified for this job?" It wasn't that she didn't expect this. She had always known the world would look at her differently. People from small towns, people like her, often had to work harder just to be seen as equal. And yet, hearing the whispers stung more than she expected. It wasn't just curiosity. There was an edge to it, a sense of superiority that made her skin prickle. She walked past the open offices, heads turning as she passed, glances lingering just a second too long. The men and women in their crisp suits couldn't have looked more out of place in their judgment. She could feel their eyes on her like weights pressing down on her shoulders. But she kept walking, pretending she didn't hear them, pretending she didn't feel the shift in the air when she entered a room. The worst part wasn't the whispers themselves. It was the way people treated her, as though her accent made her something less. Something to be pitied, something that didn't belong. She wanted to stop, to turn and face them, but she knew better. She had a job to do. She had to prove herself, not just to them, but to herself. And so, she kept walking, the whispers trailing behind her like a shadow. The first day it felt like walking on a tightrope, every step delicate, every move scrutinized. But as she sat at her desk the next morning, the soft morning light spilling through the tall windows, something within her shifted. Today, it was a new day, a fresh start. She glanced at the stack of paperwork before her, the folders she'd been given, each one a new project waiting for her to dive into. The rhythm of the office had already settled around her, the hum of phones ringing and the clattering of keyboards. She could do this. She had done it before, though it felt different now, as though the eyes of the entire office were still upon her. She breathed in deeply and let the air settle in her lungs, steadying herself. She had to focus. She could not afford to let the whispers and stares dictate her pace. Her skills, her knowledge, her dedication, that was what mattered. That was the foundation she would build this new chapter upon. It didn't matter what they thought of her accent or her appearance. She wasn't here to fit in. She was here to excel. As the minutes passed, the unfamiliarity of the office began to fade, replaced by a growing confidence. She was accustomed to being the outsider. Her whole life had been about standing out, about proving that she could rise above the prejudices and assumptions others had about her. By the time the first meeting of the day arrived, she was ready. Her hands weren't trembling anymore. Her voice, though still thick with the traces of her past, carried a steadiness that cut through the doubts. When she spoke, it was clear that she knew the material, clear that she belonged in this room, no matter how different she seemed. As she looked around the conference table, the eyes that had once held judgment seemed to soften. They were listening. Maybe, just maybe, this would be a beginning not just for her, but for them as well. The meeting had started as every other did, a quick exchange of pleasantries, followed by the usual updates on current projects. But when it was her turn to speak, the room fell into a subtle but palpable stillness. She had felt the weight of their gazes the moment she stood up, but she had come prepared. She had spent years perfecting her ability to be heard, despite the accents, the background, the hurdles. Her presentation was flawless. The words she spoke, though wrapped in an accent that wasn't quite like theirs, were clear, measured, and direct. She outlined the goals of the project with the precision that came naturally to her, outlining every detail as though it had been etched into her mind for years. She answered questions with authority, even if her answers carried the unfamiliar rhythm of her speech. Her confidence grew with every word she spoke, every glance she caught from the people around the table. But as the meeting drew to a close, she could see the subtle shifts in their expressions. Some, like Daniel from marketing, looked at her with a newfound respect, nodding at her insights. Others, though, like Marissa, looked at her with a slightly furrowed brow, her lips pressed tight, as though deciding whether or not to hold her opinions back. It was clear that the whispers of the previous day hadn't completely died down. Some people still looked at her, as if she were an anomaly, someone to be pitted or perhaps dismissed. But then, there were the others, those who had begun to see past her accent, past her appearance, and into the strength she carried. As the meeting ended and the team dispersed, she remained seated for a moment, collecting her things. A small part of her wondered if any of them had truly heard her or if they had simply tolerated her presence. But then she remembered. She hadn't come here to be accepted. She had come here to prove that she could be more than they assumed. And today, she had done just that. The next day, the office felt different. There was a quiet tension in the air, the kind that followed an awkward encounter. As she walked to her desk, she could hear it again, the hushed voices, the half-hidden snickers, the subtle shifts in posture whenever she passed by. She sat down, trying to focus on the task at hand, but the murmurs were impossible to ignore. Someone was imitating her accent, just loud enough for her to hear, a mocking tone wrapped in exaggerated syllables. It wasn't subtle. It was deliberate. Her heart sank, but she kept her head down, hoping it would pass. But then, a voice cut through the quiet. "Can't believe they hired someone who sounds like that," someone whispered just behind her. She froze, the words sinking deep into her skin, far more painful than she had anticipated. She wanted to turn around, to confront them, but she couldn't. Not yet. Not in this moment. Instead, she focused on her work, burying herself in the reports, the numbers, the details that always kept her grounded. She had learned long ago to ignore the taunts, to stay silent, But today, it felt harder than usual. The laughter seemed to follow her everywhere, at the coffee machine, across the conference room, even when she passed by the elevator. It was as though they believed she couldn't hear, that she wouldn't notice. As though her accent made her less capable, less deserving of respect. But there was something inside her that refused to break, something fierce and quiet that kept her from sinking into the shame they tried to impose. She had been through worse than mockery, worse than the sting of cruel words. She had built herself from the ground up, and no one here would ever take that away from her. Instead of crumbling, she straightened her back, adjusted the collar of her blouse, and turned her attention back to the task at hand. Their mockery would not define her. She would rise above it, as she always had. It was Wednesday afternoon when the shift happened. The whispered jokes had been relentless for days, but now, it wasn't just about her. The focus had changed. Someone new had become the target, and she felt the shift like an electric current running through the office. It started innocently enough, a comment here, a chuckle there. But as the hours passed, the whispers grew louder. At first, she thought she was imagining it, but the realization hit her hard. They were targeting Daniel, the young man from marketing, the one who had treated her with kindness when the others had made her feel invisible, was now being mocked for his politeness, for his soft-spoken demeanor. His careful, respectful way of speaking was suddenly the punchline of their jokes. She could hear them now, just as she had heard them mocking her before. "Is he always like that?" someone asked, their voice dripping with sarcasm. "Yeah, Mr. Nice Guy," another replied, voice rising with exaggerated sweetness. "Maybe you should try being a little more assertive." The laughter echoed through the hall, light and mocking, as Daniel sat at his desk, oblivious to the growing tension around him. She could see it in his eyes when he looked up at her. He was uncomfortable, confused, perhaps even ashamed, but he wasn't saying a word. He was trying to ignore it, the way she had tried to ignore it, but it was clear the mockery was starting to sink in. Something snapped inside her. She couldn't let this happen. Not to him. Not to anyone. She stood up from her desk, her chair scraping against the floor. Her movements were deliberate, measured, as she walked over to his cubicle. When she reached his side, he looked up, startled but grateful. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly, her voice steady despite the rising tide of frustration inside her. He nodded, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's fine. I'll be okay." But she wasn't sure she believed him. And as the mocking laughter continued to ripple through the office, she knew something had to change. It wasn't just about standing up for herself anymore. It was about standing up for each other. The joke started on Thursday, after lunch. At first, they were subtle, light-hearted comments disguised as humor, the kind you could almost laugh off if you didn't know better. But by the time afternoon rolled around, the thinly veiled taunts began to grow more pointed, more deliberate. It began with Clara, the young woman from social media, who always seemed to have a ready remark for anyone who didn't fit the mold. She made the first jab, her voice sweetly exaggerated as she turned toward Ivy's desk. "I'm just saying," Clara said loudly. "With an accent like that, it's no wonder people can't understand you. Maybe you should stick to writing memos." Her eyes sparkled with an almost playful cruelty, but it was clear to everyone around the room that she was taking aim at Ivy. The room fell silent for a beat before a few of the other colleagues tittered, exchanging glances and trying to pretend they hadn't heard her. Ivy's face didn't flinch. She had learned long ago not to let it show when she was hurt, but the sting of their words felt like an open wound, still raw. "I didn't realize we were at the comedy club today," she replied, her voice steady, calm, and not at all amused. It wasn't the response they were expecting. They were waiting for her to shrink, to be embarrassed, to give them the satisfaction of her discomfort. Instead, she stood her ground. The laughter died down, but that didn't stop the jokes from flowing. They grew bolder. Even Marissa, who had once pretended to be friendly, joined in. "Maybe she just needs subtitles," Marissa smirked, her tone dripping with mockery. The laughter that followed was louder, sharper. But this time, Ivy wasn't alone. Daniel, who had been keeping to himself, suddenly stood up. He shot a quick look at Ivy before turning to face the room. His voice was quiet but firm. "That's not funny," he said, his words cutting through the laughter like a knife. It silenced them, if only for a moment. And though Ivy didn't know it yet, that moment was all she needed to realize that maybe, just maybe, things were starting to shift. The days began to blur together after the joke started, each one another ripple in the growing tide of mockery. But for Ivy, there was a strange sort of peace in the routine that followed. The laughter still stung, still pricked at her skin like 1,000 tiny needles, but she had learned to carry on. She had learned to endure. Each morning, she walked into the office with the same quiet determination. Her steps were steady, her head held high, though she could feel the weight of their eyes on her. Every word she spoke, every email she sent, every meeting she attended was just another quiet act of defiance, a small victory against the ridicule that followed her. She didn't need to announce her strength. It was in the way she moved through the day, in the way she quietly did her job without letting their words get to her. The others hadn't noticed it yet, but Daniel had. He watched as Ivy continued to perform flawlessly, each task handled with the same care and precision, as if nothing had changed. Despite the whispers, despite the jokes, she never faltered. There were no outbursts, no retaliations. She simply did her work, and her work spoke for her. It wasn't loud, the way she fought back. There were no dramatic moments, no confrontations. It was the quiet resilience that went unnoticed by most. But Daniel saw it. He saw the way Ivy continued to give her all, even when the office seemed intent on tearing her down. One day, as she sat at her desk, clicking through a series of reports, Daniel approached. He didn't say anything at first, just stood next to her, watching her work. There was a slight smile on his face, one of respect, one that seemed to carry more meaning than he could articulate. "Thanks for staying strong," he finally said quietly, his voice low enough so only she could hear. "It's impressive." Ivy glanced up at him, her eyes meeting his. There was no need for words beyond that. She didn't need anyone to tell her she was doing the right thing. She knew, and that was enough for now. The day started like any other. Ivy had grown used to the whispered remarks, the sideways glances, and the occasional outright mockery that followed her wherever she went. But today, there was something different in the air, a subtle shift that she couldn't quite place. It happened during lunch. She had found a quiet corner in the break room, her usual spot where she could eat in peace, away from the noise and distractions. As she opened her lunch, a few colleagues wandered in, laughing and chatting. They hadn't noticed her at first, too wrapped up in their own conversations. But then, as if by chance, one of them, a woman named Rachel, noticed Ivy sitting alone. She had never been particularly unkind to Ivy, though she hadn't exactly been friendly either. Still, Rachel was the first to approach. "Hey, Ivy, mind if I sit here?" she asked, offering a tentative smile. Ivy was taken aback for a moment. She hadn't expected any of them to approach her, but she nodded, offering a polite smile in return. Of course. As Rachel sat down, their conversation began casually. It started with small talk, how the work was going, how the weather was changing, but then Rachel asked something unexpected. "I've heard you've done some work with languages before, right?" Ivy looked at her, a little confused. "Yes," she replied cautiously. "I've studied several languages over the years." Rachel's eyes widened. "Really? That's impressive. I thought I heard someone mention you were fluent in a few different languages." She leaned forward, curiosity in her eyes. "How did you learn all that?" Ivy's lips curled slightly, her gaze softening. "It's not something I talk about much here," she admitted, "but I've worked as a translator in the past. For the UN, mostly. It was an opportunity that came about when I was living abroad." There was a brief silence as Rachel absorbed the information. For the first time, Ivy saw genuine respect in her colleague's eyes. "Wow, that's incredible," Rachel said, almost in awe. "I had no idea." Ivy nodded, smiling softly. "It's just a part of who I am, that's all." And for the first time since she'd walked into the office, Ivy realized something. She had a talent that none of them knew about, a skill that had remained hidden, even in plain sight. And now, it was slowly beginning to emerge, one conversation at a time. The following days felt heavier than usual, as though the weight of silence had settled on Ivy's shoulders. Despite the subtle shift in her relationship with Rachel, the whispers and mockery didn't stop. Instead, they became more insidious. No one said anything directly to her face, but she could feel their eyes on her. Every step she took seemed to be scrutinized, every word she spoke picked apart. The silent battle she fought each day was exhausting. She had always known that being different would require more strength than most, but she hadn't anticipated how draining it would be to keep her head high when it felt like the entire room was working against her. It wasn't just the comments anymore. It was the isolation, the subtle exclusion from conversations. No one actively shunned her, but they didn't include her either. She was an outsider, and they made sure she knew it. The office lunches, the casual after-work drinks, they were for the others. For the ones that had the right accent, the right appearance, the right fit. And yet, she never let it show. No one ever saw how hard it was for her to smile through the stares, to keep her voice steady when she spoke, to do her job flawlessly despite the constant sting of being looked down upon. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep it up, but quitting wasn't an option. She had worked too hard to get here, too long to let the shadows of their judgment take her down. There were moments, brief moments, when the battle felt too much to bear. She would catch herself in the mirror, seeing the exhaustion in her eyes, feeling the weight of the unspoken hostility around her. But then she'd remember why she was here. She was here because she had the talent, the knowledge, the drive to succeed. Not because of her accent, not because of where she came from. So, each day, she fought the battle silently, privately. And though no one saw it, she knew the war wasn't over. And as long as she stood, as long as she kept moving forward, they couldn't win. It was a Thursday afternoon when it happened. Ivy was hunched over her desk, buried in a pile of paperwork that never seemed to end. The hum of the office was louder than usual today, the clattering of keyboards and low murmurs filling the air. She was used to the noise by now, the constant background hum of activity that made the days feel long. But today there was something different, something unexpected. It came in the form of a brief but simple gesture. As she reached for her coffee cup, her hand brushing against the edge of her desk, the mug slipped from her grasp and toppled to the floor, shattering into pieces. The sound was sharp and sudden, causing a few heads to turn. Ivy froze, her heart sinking as she looked at the mess before her. She didn't move at first, not because she didn't want to clean up, but because she knew what would follow. The laughter, the judgment. It was always the same. People would find a way to make her feel small, and for a moment, the weight of it all pressed down on her. But then, something shifted. From the corner of her eye, she saw Daniel from marketing stand up. He didn't laugh. He didn't look at her with that pitying glance. Instead, he stepped over to her desk, crouched down, and began to collect the shards of broken ceramic, his movements calm and precise. "Let me help you with that," he said quietly, his voice soft but steady. Ivy blinked, taken aback by the gesture. It wasn't just the act itself. It was the way he didn't make a big deal out of it, didn't try to turn it into some grand gesture. He simply saw someone in need and did what needed to be done. For a moment, their eyes met, and she saw it in his genuine care, a kindness that wasn't born out of obligation, but of something real, something she hadn't experienced in a while. She gave him a small, thankful smile. "Thanks," she said, her voice soft but full of meaning. And just like that, the walls around her began to shift, if only a little. In the midst of the mocking, the isolation, and the silence, this was the flash of kindness that reminded her that she wasn't alone. It was another late afternoon, the kind where the office lights cast long shadows across the desks, and the sounds of typing had begun to slow. Ivy was at her desk, staring at the same report she had been editing for hours. The hours seemed to stretch on endlessly, the familiar rhythm of the office around her, making her feel like a quiet observer in a world that didn't really notice her. As she sat there, absorbed in her work, she heard footsteps approaching. At first, she thought it was someone walking by, but then the sound stopped. It was Daniel again. "I've been meaning to tell you," he began, his voice casual, but with an earnestness she didn't expect. She looked up from her screen, caught off guard. "You did a great job in the meeting yesterday. Your points were spot on." Ivy blinked, surprised. The words hung in the air for a moment, but she didn't respond immediately. She wasn't used to compliments. Not like this, not in the office, where the tone was usually laced with hidden judgments. She had grown accustomed to brushing off the more insincere praise. But Daniel wasn't mocking her. He wasn't looking for anything. He simply offered the words and waited for her to take them. She could see it in his eyes, the absence of sarcasm, the simple kindness in the gesture. "Thank you," Ivy said quietly, not sure what else to say. But even as the words left her lips, she could feel the weight of something unspoken. She didn't want to seem too grateful, not wanting to give them more reason to gossip about her. So she turned her attention back to the report, hoping the moment would pass. But Daniel didn't move. He didn't walk away. Instead, he gave her a small smile and nodded, like it was the most natural thing in the world to offer someone praise without expecting anything in return. "I meant it," he said before turning to leave. Ivy sat in the stillness, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. For the first time in weeks, she felt something stir inside her, a small, flickering warmth. And though the compliment went unnoticed by most, it was enough to remind her that kindness still existed in this place. It wasn't the grand gestures or the confrontations that made the most impact. It was the quiet moments, the ones that slipped by unnoticed by most, but left a lasting impression on those who were paying attention. Ivy had begun to notice the subtle shifts in the office, the small changes that spoke volumes. It was small things at first. Rachel, who used to avoid her, now nodded when they crossed paths in the hallway. Even Marissa, who had once been the ringleader of the mocking, seemed to take a step back. She wasn't as quick to join in on the jokes anymore, her glances at Ivy no longer filled with judgment. The real change came when they started including her in discussions. It was subtle at first, just a few sentences added to a meeting, an invitation to share her opinion on a project, but soon it became clear. They were listening. They weren't just tolerating her presence anymore. They were hearing her. Daniel had become her quiet ally. He never made a show of it, never pointed out the obvious, but his actions spoke volumes. Whenever someone questioned her, whenever they hesitated, he would speak up. He wasn't just defending her. He was ensuring her voice was heard, making it clear that she wasn't just there to fill space. She was there because she deserved to be. And then there was Blake, the sales manager who had made her feel small from day one. He had started changing too. The condescending comments had stopped, and while he still kept his distance, his gaze wasn't as dismissive. He didn't treat her with the same open disregard as before. It was as if something had shifted in him as well. Ivy hadn't expected any of this. She hadn't expected anyone to change their perspective, to truly see her for who she was, not just the accent or the clothes or the assumptions. But slowly, without fanfare, the tide had begun to turn. They were starting to understand her. And in doing so, they were beginning to understand themselves a little better too. She was no longer the outsider. She was a part of something, a team, a conversation, a culture, one that had begun to open its eyes. And for the first time in a long while, Ivy felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon, just when Ivy thought she had adjusted to the rhythm of the office. It was the end of another long week, the tension between her and the rest of the team no longer so overt, but still present, like a quiet undercurrent. She had convinced herself that she could handle it, that the silence, the subtle exclusion, was just part of the price she had to pay to be here. But that day, something snapped. It started with a simple remark, a comment made in passing by one of the higher-ups. It was meant as a joke, a careless jab, but hit her harder than she could have anticipated. She had just finished a presentation to a small group when one of the senior managers, a man she had always tried to impress, leaned back in his chair and said, "You should really work on the accent if you want to get ahead here." It wasn't funny, not in the least. The words, coming from him, felt like a betrayal, like everything she had worked for, every inch of ground she had gained in this office, was nothing more than a joke to him. She had smiled through so many similar comments, kept her head down, swallowed the sting of mockery over and over again. But this time she couldn't. Something inside her snapped. The quiet endurance that had gotten her through the worst moments now gave way to something else, something raw, something fierce. Without thinking, she stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor, cutting through the air like a blade. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward her. She took a step forward, her pulse pounding in her ears. For the first time, she didn't care about the consequences. She wasn't going to let this pass. Not anymore. "Excuse me." Her voice was steady, but the fire behind it was unmistakable. "I've worked harder than anyone here. I've earned my place, and if you think for 1 second that my accent disqualifies me, then you don't know a thing about what it means to be good at your job." The room was still. She could feel the heat of their stares, but she didn't flinch. For the first time, they were seeing her for who she truly was. And she wasn't going anywhere. The silence in the room stretched on, thick with disbelief. Ivy stood, her chest rising and falling with each breath, the weight of her words settling into the space between her and the others. She had never raised her voice like this, never let her frustration spill over in such a raw, unguarded way. It wasn't a rant. It was a quiet declaration of truth, and the impact of it hung heavy in the air. For a moment, no one spoke. The senior manager who had made the comment looked stunned, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for a response. But Ivy didn't give him the chance. She had said everything she needed to say. The room was still, the tension palpable, until it was broken by a hesitant voice, Daniel's. "I think she's right," he said, his tone gentle but unwavering. "It's not about the accent or the clothes or any of that. Ivy's been doing the work. She's been here every day, busting her ass to make sure everything's right. We've all seen it." Ivy's gaze flickered to him. There was no sarcasm in his words, no attempt to downplay the gravity of the situation. He was speaking from a place of truth, and something inside her softened at the simple solidarity of his stance. The senior manager shifted uncomfortably, looking at the others in the room, searching for someone to back him up. But the faces around him told a different story. Rachel, who had once kept her distance, nodded in agreement. Marissa, usually quick to join in the judgment, seemed to shift uneasily in her seat. The revelation hit them all at once. Ivy hadn't just been enduring the mockery. She had been excelling despite it. She had been quietly achieving, and none of them had bothered to see it. But now, with the veil pulled back, they couldn't ignore her anymore. The senior manager cleared his throat. I didn't mean to offend you," he muttered, his voice smaller now. Ivy stood there, feeling the weight of the moment. But there was no sense of victory in her. She had simply done what was necessary, what was right. And for the first time, the office seemed to realize it too. The revelation in the conference room had left a quiet ripple in its wake. Though the senior manager's apology was brief and unconvincing, something had changed in the air. The mocking had ceased, replaced by a palpable shift in how Ivy was perceived. But the real change came when Ivy was unexpectedly called upon to demonstrate something she had kept hidden, something even they hadn't known about her. It was the following week, during a meeting with an important international client. The team had been struggling with a translation issue. One of the client's documents contained technical jargon in several languages that none of the in-house team could fully understand. They were about to send it off for external translation, costing the company valuable time, when Ivy quietly raised her hand. "I can handle it," she said, her voice steady. "I've worked with documents like these before. If you'd like, I can translate it myself." A few heads turned, but no one said anything at first. They were still adjusting to the idea that Ivy might have more to offer than they had initially thought. The senior manager, still recovering from his earlier slip-up, hesitated. "Are you sure?" he asked, his tone careful now, though he still hadn't fully grasped the scope of her abilities. Ivy gave him a measured nod. "I've handled more complex documents for the UN before. It's just a matter of getting the terminology right." The team exchanged looks, some still skeptical, others curious. Daniel gave her a supportive smile, and Rachel raised an eyebrow, surprised. They hadn't known. None of them had known that Ivy wasn't just another office worker, that she had a skill far beyond what any of them had imagined. Ivy turned her attention to the document, scanning through the text with practiced ease. She worked quickly, her hands gliding over the keyboard, typing the translations with precise accuracy. Within minutes, she had completed the first draft, and the room fell silent, watching in awe as she handed it over. The client was impressed. The team was stunned. And Ivy? She simply smiled, her confidence no longer hidden beneath layers of doubt. She had shown them a skill they hadn't known existed. Her quiet power, her silent strength, no longer invisible. The following days felt different. There was a shift in how the office treated Ivy, less like a background player and more like a valued member of the team. It wasn't as though anyone had openly apologized for their past behavior, but the subtle changes were undeniable. Conversations included her now, her suggestions were taken seriously, and when her accent slipped into her speech, no one flinched or mocked. Instead, they listened. It was one Thursday afternoon when it finally clicked for Ivy. She had been in and out of meetings all day, and when she returned to her desk, her inbox was flooded with messages from her colleagues, requests, inquiries, and thanks. They were asking her for her thoughts, for her expertise. For the first time, she realized that no one was doubting her abilities anymore. They were seeking her input because they recognized her value. The real moment of recognition came when she was called into the senior manager's office. She had expected another routine check-in, but when she entered, the atmosphere was different. He stood up when she walked in, a sign of respect that she hadn't expected. His usual air of superiority was gone, replaced by a more humbled demeanor. "I wanted to thank you," he began, not bothering to sit down, "for the work you've done, and for what you showed the team last week. I think we all missed the mark when it came to you. We underestimated you." Ivy didn't know how to respond. She had expected a half-hearted apology or maybe a few more patronizing comments. But this was different. This was recognition. True recognition. "I'm sorry for the way we treated you," he continued. "Your skills, your professionalism, your dedication, they speak for themselves. And I wanted to let you know that you're a valuable part of this team. I see that now." For a moment, Ivy simply stood there, processing the words. It was a quiet victory, one she hadn't expected. She had fought for this, for respect, for understanding, but she had never thought she'd hear it so plainly from the person who had once belittled her. "I appreciate that," she said finally, her voice steady. It wasn't just gratitude. It was the sound of someone who had finally been seen, truly seen. The following week, the office buzzed with an excitement Ivy hadn't anticipated. The team had been tasked with preparing a major pitch for a high-profile client, one that could propel the company to new heights. Everyone was on edge, working overtime, fine-tuning presentations and reports. But Ivy wasn't just another team member anymore. She was an integral part of the project. Her contributions were no longer overlooked. She was leading discussions, offering insights, and providing translations for critical documents. Then, the day of the presentation arrived. Ivy stood at the back of the conference room, watching as the senior manager and the others took their positions at the table. She had prepared everything she could, but now it was out of her hands. The team was ready, more than ready, in fact. They had practiced their parts, refined every detail, and there was no room for error. As the meeting began, she could see the nervous energy in the room. Even the senior manager, who had once exuded nothing but arrogance, looked a little less certain. But Ivy didn't let it bother her. She knew the work was solid. She knew the presentation would speak for itself. Halfway through the meeting, the client, a sharp-eyed woman with a reputation for being tough, paused the proceedings. She looked at the senior manager, then at the team, and her gaze eventually landed on Ivy. The room went still as she addressed Ivy directly. "I've been following the progress on this project," she began, her voice cold and measured. "And I have to say, I'm impressed. Your translations were flawless, and your insights have been invaluable." Ivy felt her pulse quicken, a mix of pride and surprise flooding through her. But what came next left her speechless. "We didn't expect this from someone in your position," the client continued, her voice cutting through the room. "And honestly, we're shocked that it took us this long to see what you bring to the table." The words hung in the air, sharp and unexpected. Ivy could feel the eyes of the entire room on her. But for once, the shock was no longer hers alone. Everyone in that room understood now. She wasn't just the woman they had once underestimated. She was an essential part of their success. The following week brought more change than Ivy had expected. The senior manager, who had once been so distant and dismissive, began to seek her input more frequently, calling her into meetings and consulting her on strategies. There was a noticeable shift in the office dynamics as well. Conversations once dominated by snide comments and exclusion had transformed into collaborative discussions where Ivy's opinions were valued. She could feel the change in how people saw her, but it wasn't until the client's follow-up meeting that the unexpected truth was revealed. It started with a simple email. Ivy was wrapping up her day when she received a message from the senior manager, asking her to meet him in his office. There was no prelude, no warning, just a time and place. When she arrived, she found him sitting behind his desk, his fingers tapping anxiously on the surface. "I need to talk to you about something," he began, his voice uncharacteristically cautious. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, everything that's happened, really, the way we treated you." Ivy froze. She had expected some kind of formal acknowledgement of her work, maybe even a thank you for her contributions to the recent pitch. But she hadn't expected this. "I've realized," he continued, looking down at his hands, "that we didn't just misunderstand you. We made assumptions. And the truth is, I've been guilty of it too." The weight of his words hit her like a punch to the gut. The senior manager wasn't just admitting he had been wrong about her work. He was admitting something far more uncomfortable, the way they had all viewed her from the beginning, based on nothing more than her accent and her appearance. "I've seen the value you bring to this team, Ivy," he said, his voice finally steady. "And I've seen the way you've handled everything. But what I haven't seen until recently is the real reason you're here. You've been more than capable. You've been everything we needed. But we never bothered to ask you the one thing that matters most." She looked at him, waiting for him to finish. "The truth is, Ivy," he said, his eyes meeting hers for the first time with real sincerity, "we never saw the person behind the work. And that was our mistake." The confession hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable. The senior manager's words, though genuine, left Ivy with a strange mix of emotions. Part of her felt vindicated, like she had finally been seen for who she truly was, beyond the stereotypes and the dismissive judgments. But another part of her, a deeper, quieter part, was unsure how to process it. She had never expected an apology, never imagined that her colleagues would come around so quickly. And now that it was happening, it felt almost too late. As she left the senior manager's office, her thoughts were in turmoil. The sudden shift in how she was treated felt like a double-edged sword. It was validation she had fought so hard for, but it also opened a wound she wasn't sure she was ready to heal. How could she trust these people now? Was their newfound respect genuine, or was it just a consequence of the recent success she had helped them achieve? The real conflict, however, lay within the people around her. Daniel, the one person who had always stood by her, had been supportive through everything. He had quietly defended her when no one else would, his actions speaking louder than words. But even he seemed to be shifting in subtle ways, caught between his newfound respect for Ivy and the office politics he had long been part of. It wasn't long before she noticed the divide. There were some who continued to avoid her, who still held on to the old narrative of her as the outsider. And then there were those, like Daniel, who had genuinely begun to see her. But the lines weren't so clear-cut anymore. Some who had once been vocal in their mockery were now apologetic. But Ivy couldn't tell if their change of heart was driven by genuine remorse or the fear of being left behind in the changing office dynamic. The truth was, Ivy found herself caught between worlds, between the people who had once mocked her and those who had begun to accept her. The alliances, once so clear, were now torn. She couldn't help but wonder which ones would last, and which ones would fade away as quickly as the mockery had. The apology came unexpectedly, in a way Ivy never could have predicted. It was 2 weeks after the senior manager's confession and the subtle shift in the office. She had been trying to keep a distance, focusing on her work, allowing the newfound respect to settle in without overthinking it. But some things couldn't be ignored. She had noticed Marissa, the woman who had once led the charge in mocking her, watching her more closely than usual. That afternoon, as the office was winding down, Ivy returned from a meeting to find Marissa standing near her desk. She had expected another thinly veiled comment or a patronizing smile, the kind Marissa used to give. But this time, there was something different in her expression. Marissa's usual confidence had been replaced by an unusual uncertainty. "I need to talk to you," Marissa said, her voice hesitant. The change in her tone was startling, and for a moment, Ivy didn't know what to make of it.